Welcome to the Occult Rejects. A very special episode today. This is the first time that I've ever had these two on at once, and they're two of my favorite people to have on. It's always like story time with Robby. Pretty much the same thing if you're messing with Headless as well. Always tons of information when I have them come on and great perspectives on the topic that we're talking about. And finally got them on together to talk about Virgil. And co-hosting with me tonight. If I was having Robby on, I gotta have Teresa on. So felt it was only right. So we got her on for story time as well. So,
awesome. My favorite time.
yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
Yes.
this time it's just a little bit more at night, but I guess story time that makes sense. So.
Yeah.
Bedtime
story time.
Perfect.
Real quick, I mean, I know there is a bunch of us here, but real quick, because there's also new viewers, especially on video platforms and on podcasts. Maybe you don't know who everybody is, but we'll start off with you, Teresa, real quick. If you just want to introduce yourself and let people know about your other work that you do as well.
Sure. So thanks for having me for this. I'm very pumped. But yeah, people can find me also on the Spiritual Gangsters podcast. All the major podcast platforms. Instagram, that's just my name, Teresa.Cassar. And then on Twitter, I am TS Gangsters Pod. Yeah.
Awesome. And I'm pretty sure your stuff will be on the bottom.
Thanks.
And then we'll head over to you, Headless. Let everybody know what's up with your show and what you're about.
I'm the Headless Giant. I have multiple lives that I try to do during the week, and I'm talking about Virgil. There's my last episode. I was talking about satanic pop music, and that was a great episode. So if you look up satanic pop music, Headless Giant, you'll find some interesting stuff there. So check that out on Twitter and YouTube.
Awesome. And Robby, last but not least, let everybody know what's up with you and where they can find your other stuff as well, your audio.
Yeah, generally, I'm an artist. I mostly do art, and then in my spare time, I do a lot of research into various, unseen, hidden, occult, esoteric topics in regard to symbolism and history. If you want to check out my art or any of the podcasts I've done, you can go to my Linktree, which is RMARX, one word, and that'll pull up all my links.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm pretty sure everybody's links are in the bottom. If not, I will add them after the fact. Actually, the idea came from this is because Headless actually had hit me up and I think we were talking and it was just random. And he had mentioned that he had Robby coming on. I was like, oh, holy shit. I was like, wow, that's awesome. That's, and then he had told me what the topic was. And it's funny how I've obviously known of this person's work, but just did not know exactly who was it attributed to.
Mm-hmm.
But I had just recently came across the name myself, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but I'm pretty sure I was looking at the OTO Gnostic Saint lists, the list that they have for saints, and it brought me to somebody that when I clicked on it, it happened to mention that they were influenced by this guy named Virgil. And it made me think of, Walking Dead. So I clicked on it. And then I was like, oh, okay. All right. I've heard of this guy's work. I just never knew who he was. And then a few weeks later, Headless brought him up about talking about him with Robby. And I was like, oh, this is perfect timing. I was like, maybe we could schedule both of you on my show to kick this topic around. So,
this was inspired. I was listening to your interview with Robby, and he mentioned Virgil and how he was connected to all this stuff. And I'm like, I got to get him on because this is actually really intimately linked with my work and Operation GCD's work on the Society of the Cincinnati. And I think Virgil had a big deal to play with that. Now, Virgil, in a lot of ways, is very unappreciated in this century. Very few people are actually acknowledging him. He's more of a background character, but I think he was very central when it comes to the founding of the United States, the Society of the Cincinnati, and all the rest of that stuff. But in the tradition of Virgil and people who like his poetry and everything else, I'm going to do a little bit of libromancy. Now, libromancy is where you flip through a book and you find a line out of his poetry and you read that and it sort of reads your future. So I'm going to do that. I've got Virgil's Gorgics right here, or Georgics. This is where you get the name George from. It means of the land or agrarian, pertaining to agrarian stuff. So I'm going to close my eyes and flip through it. I'm here on page 95 in Virgil's Gorgics. This is the third Gorgic, and here we go. Over their shoulders, even as they flee, two monuments of Rome's past victories seized from foes faraway places in the world. It's 3 lines. Over their shoulders. It's interesting because I just got done reading a section where he mentioned the Greek Noah. And the Greek Noah threw stones over his shoulders to create humanity again.
The dragon's teeth that rose up as a crop of men.
It's almost like people looting Rome are actually creating new people when you put the two together.
That's really interesting that you mentioned that, because like this image just went through my head. I can't remember who did the art of it, but there was like somebody, I think I was going to cover, or I did, and like they had a very interesting picture where like this person was holding a bag that had boxes in the bag. It was like very weird. Almost looked like stones, chunks of stones in the bag. And I was like, that's got to be for a fucking reason. I don't know, just what you just said right there, like for a flashback of that illustration in my head. Sorry.
That's interesting. Yeah, the Greek Noah created a race of people called the Leleges, or the new souls. And so that's something very important when it comes to Greek mythology, because you had the old souls that came from the line of the Titans, and then you had the new souls, which were made by throwing these stones over your shoulder, which, it's a different take. It doesn't sound like Noah, but that's the same character. Right. Robby, do you want to give us an introduction to Virgil and his work?
Yeah, sure. So now when we get into Virgil, the Eclogues are his earliest attributed poems, and that's from about 41 BC to 37 BC. But his more famous works are the Georgics, which you just pulled that line from, and the Ennead. And basically, he's affected and contributed to so much of modern poetry and storytelling and the idea. But you got to figure this early Georgics was basically a manual for the foundation and beginning of Rome, so that they would have almost like a manual on how to take care of the land, take care of the bulls, raise bees, basically prune apple trees and graft other types of plants onto them. So it was basically an instruction manual. It was a new kind of literature at the time that was like an instruction manual for the creation of the rise of the state of Rome.
Absolutely. And as long as it's been a human zoo, there's been human zookeepers. And I think the works of Virgil really helped shape what the human zookeepers in the style of Rome would be. And we see that same pattern repeating over and over and over again. And one of the main tenets of Virgil's work, especially in Georgics, is always talking about toil. And toil is what every man is doomed to, and also delights in doing. So right. what he's trying to explain there is you have to keep the people busy. And it's that busy work, that agrarian spirit, that sort of Protestant work ethic that you see carried on over and over throughout these generations. Right. Now, a lot of Virgil's work was reprinted and taught to all the school children in Rome. This is one of the very first things that they would read. So it was vastly influential all the way through the Christian era. Now, a lot of Virgil's work was admired by the Christians as well, even after the conversion. So we're talking about 1st century BC all the way through up to, Dante's Inferno, where Virgil becomes a character in that book. So
so now in regard to probably his most famous saying that we see that made it onto the American $1 bill, being the Novus Ordo Seclorum, which has taken on the identity of the idea of the New World Order, of this new order of the ages, right? It came from his very first work. being the eclogues, right? And basically, it was in the eclogue called Polio, lines 7 through 10, that we get this prophecy from the Cumaean Sibyl. And as far as the Cumaean Sibyl, when you look into her, it's Eliak Sayos Boule, which is the counsel of God, is basically what this Sibylline prophecy is, right? And it was a Judaic Christian Hellenistic period, basically prophetess, right? And she was set down in Pythos, right? This is where basically the python is killed and it kind of rots inside these volcanic vents. And they have this Sibylline prophecy that basically sets over the vent on a tripod, and she breathes in the fumes of the volcano, which they believe is the rotting carcass of this python, right? And this is the same place where when Saturn threw up his children, the first thing that came out was the stone, and the stone landed in Pythos. So this has multiple factor, and this was generally the Sibylline prophecy was the prophetess of Apollo. So she was basically speaking the words of Apollo in prophecy form to these early, peoples. And it was, and like we talked about, it was like the Bene Gesserit witch almost in
Right.
Dune, where they were actually directing society and directing the bloodlines and telling the generals what wars to fight and not to fight in cryptic ways. Sometimes the person would mistake it, and go into battle thinking they were going to win and end up losing. But it was very much directing the flow and the course and the movement of the upper echelon within Roman society as a whole.
Right. And this, what you're talking about, this is the Oracle at Delphi.
Delphi, right.
One of the main articles of faith, I guess, at the Oracle at Delphi is the concept of know thyself. Yep. So if you know yourself, you'll understand the prophecy. If you don't know yourself, you won't understand the prophecy. One of the most famous prophecies coming out of the Oracle at Delphi was delivered to a guy named Philip II of Macedon. And Philip II of Macedon was the father of Alexander the Great. And he got the prophecy that the bull is crowned and ready for slaughter. And so he believed that was in reference to Persia, right? Because Persia had this bull worship and they had all of the things like that. So he goes out and announces it. I think it was the next day or like 2 days later. He says, the oracles are on our side. We're getting ready to move on Persia. And immediately as he's trying to make this prophecy or make everybody know about the prophecy, an assassin comes up behind him and slits his throat. The bull was crowned and ready for slaughter. He didn't know himself. Now, what's also very important about Philip of Macedon that actually shapes Roman history later on is the sacred wars. So there were several sacred wars fought over the site at Delphi, which ended up bringing down the Athenian democracy. So as we know, you've got the democracy of Athens, which is a huge influence over the Republic of Rome and the Republic of the United States. So what ended up happening was Athens had a proxy war with the rest of the tribes of Greece. And they had this group of people who were occupying and terrorizing all of the people going to Delphi to have their fortunes read and everything else. So Philip decided, and I think it's not the Hanseatic League, it's a different league. He united a bunch of tribes and he was sort of the leader, and he decided he was going to rid Delphi of this proxy force that was working for Athens to basically take control over Delphi, the holiest site. As you mentioned, this stone that was inside of Kronos that ended up splitting open and then falling on the ground, it's called the Omphalos stone. And the Omphalos stone is in the shape of a beehive. Right. And this beehive is where Zeus released two eagles, and the two eagles would come together at the navel of the world. And that's what Omphalos means, is the navel of the world. right? And they came together right over Delphi, and that's where you have the Omphalos beehive stone. And we see the beehive just repeating over and over again, especially in Greek culture. The tomb of Agamemnon is considered to be like one of their most sacred sites, which is a tomb in the shape of a honeybee cave inside of this mountain. So it's really interesting. You've got the Omphalos, the tomb of Agamemnon, and then over and over again throughout Georgics, he mentions bee husbandry. Right.
And then like the Freemasonry of the beehive, like so
beehive.
prevalent, and the double-headed eagle, like whoa.
And the Mormons, as far as with their beehive.
Don't leave
And you see the beehive symbol in so many places. And Virgil actually, you know, when you read it, it's some of the most beautiful poetry as far as instilling, you know, visions in your mind. But he's actually teaching you and telling you, and he speaks on how to revivify a dying bee colony. And he talks about, you know, all the miscellaneous aspects of the natural forces that are affecting and why to sacrifice the bull. But anyways, the most famous of his little sayings, which is where we get the Novus Ordo Seclorum, or we actually get the prophecy of Jesus, a lot of people think, or the Antichrist, is basically from his polio in the Eclogues, which are his first works, lines 7 through 10. And he says, "Now the last age by Cumane Sibyl sung, he has come and gone, and the majestic roll of circulating centuries begins anew. Justice returns old Saturn's reign, with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. Only do thou, at the boy's birth, in whom the iron shall cease and the gold race arise, befriend him, chaste Lucinian, 'tis thine own Apollo reigns, and in this consulate the glorious age, O Polio, shall begin, and the months enter on their migration, on their mighty march." So this is basically the prophecy that they thought was divinely inspired. That was the prophecy of the coming Christ child, being that new race sent down from heaven, right? So this was, people said he was like divinely touched. He was a Sibyl, like a, you know, prophesying himself. And this is what got the attention of the state of Rome to basically bring him in and start writing propaganda for the state of Rome.
Right. And the most important piece of propaganda was the rewriting of the Iliad, right? Which would be his last work, which is the Aeneid.
Right.
And in there, you get the Iliad, which is the perspective from the Mycenaeans, right? Or the Greeks. And in the Aeneid, you have the perspective of the Trojans.
Right.
Both groups, the Greeks and the Romans, agreed that the Romans came from Troy, sailed around Greece, and landed in Rome.
Right.
So what they're saying is that Rome is the continuation of Troy. And that's a very important part of history that a lot of people seem to miss out on. It's mentioned both in the Aeneid and in the Iliad.
Right.
So these two are sort of like mirror images of each other.
And when you follow the story of the Aeneid as the Trojans are going, because basically Juno was previously Semiramis, Mother Rhea, who in Babylon had her head chopped off and fled and became Juno in Greece, whereas Saturn was Latinus, or the hidden one, and he had come from the fall of the Tower of Babel, basically. So, and they relate back the fact that the Trojans were related back to the original Phrygian mysteries, whereas Juno was related back to the Babylonian mysteries. So here you have these two different mystery systems basically fighting one another.
Right. And the Babylonian mystery systems really did have a huge impact in the form of later Persian works. So the Babylonian mystery schools really did have a huge impact on the Mithras cult in Rome, which was basically a cult made up of soldiers, right? And that's a very important thing to note, because I don't think that really stopped with the Mithras school, right? So this goes straight into the Society of the Cincinnati, because it's a society for soldiers, right? And they sort of keep that same methodology in how they do it, with a little bit of an agrarian spin on it, being that Cincinnatus is the sort of the farmer emperor, right? And that's totally Virgil, because, you know, Virgil has everything about agrarian life and how the gods relate to these different parts of the year and how they help the fields to grow and all the rest of the stuff. So it's very interrelated.
Now, as far as Virgil himself, right? He was born, his full name was Plebeius Virgilius Maro, and he was born October 15th, 70 BC, and he lived until September 21st, 19 BC. And he was basically the height of the Augustan period of Roman literature, which was basically the classic Roman poetry under the reign of Caesar Augustus. And let's see, his again, we said his three major works were the epilogues or the bucolics, the Georgics, and the Ennead. Now, Microbus says that Virgil's father was of a humble background, but most have found that he was of a higher status. He was an equestrian horseman, landowning family, and supplied Virgil with a good education starting at age 5. And Virgil studied rhetoric and medicine and astronomy, which he abandoned for philosophy. He was seen as like kind of his classmates called him Partinius, which means the virgin. He was kind of really self-withdrawn. He was very shy. And there's a lot to lead you to believe that he suffered from bad health all his life, and he was kind of an invalid, right? But nonetheless, Octavian, when the general Octavian paid off his troops in land, part of that land that he paid off his troops with was actually Virgil's family farm. And Virgil lost everything he had. And that was basically the motivation for him to write the Eclogues.
Right. He had other plans, but at that point, there was no going back. You either become a writer or you had nothing. Right.
Because he had nothing else. Yeah.
You know, that desperation really does spur those creative.
It does. Yeah, it does.
It's the creative juices flowing, and that's certainly what he was doing there.
Yeah.
And like I mentioned before, in the Middle Ages, they recognized these prophecies of Virgil as being the start of Christianity in Rome. And this is, you know, three centuries before they finally adopted it. And what's interesting is another work that I've read through is Apuleius's Golden Ass or Metamorphosis.
Yeah.
And what's interesting there is that in that book, it also deals with the mystery schools of Isis, which, you know, goes back to a lot of that Babylonian influence as well. But it also talks about this donkey. Like, he transforms into a donkey, and then he goes through all of these things. Now, they called the early Christians annulators, or worshipers of the donkey. You see the donkey on Palm Sunday, and you see the donkey reoccurring, like Balaam and the donkey, reoccurring over and over again when dealing with Jews and Christians. And so the Romans called Christians and Jews annulators in the first century because there was a definite sense of being related to these gods of donkeys, right? For instance, like Seth. So Seth is the third child of Adam and Eve, which is where everybody supposedly comes from. And it's also the Egyptian devil. So it's, you know, these two things. And so the allegation of annulator goes back all the way through the Old Testament and up into the New.
Mm. Now,
So, the two most famous works coming from Rome in this sort of time period, both really have Christian undertones, which is interesting because it carries over.
And it's you see the rising of this idea of this Christ child starting to come in to play in the vernacular of the historical movement, right? Now, when we get to the Iliad, which we were just talking about, it's an epic poem after like the Iliad and the Odyssey. At this point, Virgil was seen to be divinely inspired by everyone who read him. Like you said, they translated it. It was in the schooling. It was in the rhetoric systems. It was in, and then he was asked or commissioned by Caesar Augustus to basically compose the Iliad. And it was written in compliance with the emperor as a piece of state propaganda, underlying the founding of Rome. And we talked about, Juno and Saturn. But yeah, let's see, where do I want to go with this?
Another interesting point is that before they called it Washington, D.C.
Yeah, it was called
Rome, Maryland. And what's interesting,
it was also called Saturnus.
What?
Saturnus, right?
Yeah.
Pretty cool, probably. But they called it Rome, Maryland because there are 7 hills in Washington, D.C. And, the time period from the original colonies to the founding of the United States was over 3 centuries, right? We're talking 1492 all the way up to 1776. There's a lot of history there and a lot of mystery schools and a lot of elites working in this direction because of people like Virgil.
Right.
And unless we kind of understand that, we're really never going to see the picture that they had in mind when they set this place up, know? So taking that into account, I think this is one of the reasons why Virgil should be very closely studied, because you'll find him all over the place, all over the place.
And as far as that founding of DC, when you go back to the early Kabbalists, the most sacred number in Kabbalah is 888. So if you add 888 with 888, the positive and the negative, right, you get 1776. And they believe that it was that 1776 BC was when, who was it? Joshua, the successor of Moses, basically came into and claimed the promised land. So the significance of the 1776 foundation date at that time, it was like reestablishing this idea of this divine empire, basically. Right.
Well, just to note, the commenter mentioned Romulus and Remus. Romulus and Remus was after Troy had fallen. So what happened is they migrated from Anatolia or northern Turkey all the way over to the Italian peninsula. There were people already living there, already had a civilization called the Etruscans. Now, the Etruscans were not Romans, right? The Etruscan king was overthrown by the Roman emperors, right? So that was sort of the Romulus and Remus thing, is the wolf is like eating this old empire of the Etruscans. But, at the same time, the Etruscans had so many different influences. Archaeologists don't know what to make of the Etruscans. They keep saying stuff like, well, they had a lot of influences from the Greeks. But how do they know that the Greeks were actually influencing the Etruscans and not vice versa?
Vice versa, yeah.
There's a lot of evidence to show that. So there was a very rich interplay of cultures going on at this time. I mean, way, way back. And so
I have a question for you guys. Because you know way more about Virgil than I do. I was surprised to learn, because I know mythology a bit, but I was surprised to learn that Virgil wrote the Aeneid at the beckoning of Caesar Augustus, basically as a propaganda fluff piece to make the origin story of Rome better and like more glamorous, right? Which seems sort of like
Tying,
the
them.
United States.
Oh yeah,
Also.
but it tied the foundations of
Right.
Rome back into these ancient bloodlines,
Right.
you know, that
So,
were established.
Yeah, we glamorized it with a turkey and cranberry sauce.
Yeah.
well, you know, it's interesting. It's interesting. But is there historical evidence that Aeneas, the hero of the Aeneid, actually existed? Or is it just like all made up? Like, I'm curious, like, how historical is Virgil's writing, or is it just like a giant fantasy
Well,
in his mind?
Virgil, he said that he wanted to destroy that work because it was state propaganda,
Oh,
and it
wow.
was designed as, you know, a piece of, you know, to create the foundation story, you know. But when you get into Romulus and Remus and the wolf raising them, right? The temple priestess at the time was called the Lupa, which was a wolf, and that's in the temple of Juno. So, you know, there's also the idea that one of these temple priestesses of Juno was actually the one that raised up Romulus and Remus.
So it is a wolf mother, just not a real wolf. It's a human lady wolf.
That's the whole thing. Very far in the past, very misty. You know, a lot of these terms, the way that they overlap and interplay, you know, you can take several definitions, you know.
Well, like, I'm Italian, right? So I'm learning this, and I'm like, man, am I descended from the Trojans? Like, that's cool as fuck. And then I was like, wait, no, it's made up. I was like, no, probably not.
Well, I think there were Trojan warriors, and there was the city of Troy, you know.
Yeah,
and,
no, the city was real for sure.
Right. And they relate themselves back to the Phrygians. And with the Phrygian mysteries, that is basically the origin of the word Saturnus. That's the origin of the word mystery. That's the origin of the Phrygian hat, of the Saturn, you know, the Saturnalia, as well as the Phrygian hat of the French Revolution. You know, so we can see these ideas carrying, you know, right up through history, you know.
Well, and even
and then it gets even weirder.
Well,
It does.
yeah, and even in the Aeneid, when Aeneas goes to Carthage, right, and then ties in like the history of a whole other empire.
Yeah, that's when he makes the agreement with Dido, who goes back to, I believe it was the Carthaginians. And basically, when Aeneas leaves Dido, she ends up killing herself, you know.
Yeah, and she curses like the land or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so now, when we get into that, that Novus Ordo Seclorum and the various terms that we see transitioning to the Great Seal of the United States and the foundation, as far as, you know, ideas relating with this mythical foundation of Rome, strengthening those ties to the past bloodlines. Very much we see the same thing in America, and tying back to those same ideas and the same, you know, thoughts coming out of Mesopotamia and Phrygia.
Same hat.
Same hat. Yeah. I mean, even now the intelligence services for the United States, on their logo, they have the Phrygian hat on top of a pole.
That's the Army seal, actually.
That's the Army seal, yeah.
Army seal. It's got the Phrygian hat on the pole. What the founders would do is, as they're rallying people, they would take this pole and put the Phrygian cap on top of the pole, and then carry it around the town. And where they would plant it, everybody would come around. And and so this was also in the French Revolution. They used the same Phrygian cap. And it's funny because
that was the Sons of Liberty, basically.
Right. The Sons of Liberty, all Masons.
You ever think if that goes back to like representing the head on the stick, with the, you know, those ideas with Baphomet, with just when it was just a head on a stick?
Well, I mean, the Slain King, right? So the Slain King is a very big part in Anatolian representation, as well as in the Diana rites at the Lake Nemorensis. So there was a series of books called The Golden Bough, where they talk about the Slain King, right? And so the Slain King is this idea that you've got this king of the grove, right? And then a escaped slave would come and grab a bough off the top of the tree and then challenge the existing king so that he could become the king, and then they would fight each other to the death. Whoever wins gets to be king of the grove. Now, what's interesting is at this grove, you've got this Lake Nemi, which is a reflecting pool. Now, Diana is also syncretized with Artemis. And what we find on top of the Capitol building is this statue of freedom, which looks exactly like Artemis. And then what's in front of this statue of freedom? It's the reflecting pool. Right. Just like at this grove. And when we see them doing impeachment trials, they have a mock human sacrifice ritual where they're doing this thing where they're pretending like they're in a funerary procession going from the House to the Senate building or from the Senate to the House building. I'm not sure which, but they've got this fake funerary procession for the impeached president, which is the same sort of ritual that we see at Lake Nemi over in Italy. So there's definite contrast there. And the King of the Grove thing, I think it lasted up until Nero. It was one of the out of control emperors. It was either Nero or the guy who married his horse. I forgot his name.
Nero was a little out of control.
It starts with the C, I think.
Caligula, maybe.
Caligula. There you go.
Yeah.
I think Caligula rigged it so that he could have his guy in there as the King of the Grove. But that, I think it goes back to Etruscan times as well. But these groves were very important. And it's funny because in the Old Testament, they talk about how they're going to burn the groves of Amalek.
Right.
But they didn't have groves in that part of the world. They were talking about the Greeks. They were talking about the Romans. Those were the people who had the sacred groves. It wasn't the Amalekites. They were more Babylonian.
And that's in the groves is where you get Zeus handing down the lion skin to Orion, Hercules, basically.
Samson.
Again, back to the ideas of the mysteries and the man, the death and dying man rising and becoming the sun man, basically represented by the lion. They would wear the lion skin after they had, gone through the mysteries, as a symbol.
What do we see in the Capitol building? The apotheosis of
George Washington. Yeah.
At the same place where they're having these rituals of human sacrifice.
Oh, yeah.
The apotheosis.
The risen God, right? So now when we get into the seal itself, right? Let's see. I just had it right here. Okay, so the Great Seal in 1776, a committee appointed to design the Great Seal consisted of Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and it had the terms Annuit Conceptus, Novus Ordo Seclorum, and E Pluribus Unum, all three terms coming from Virgil, right? And the first three designs were rejected. And then in 1782, the fourth design came from the Secretary of the Continental Congress. His name was Charles Thomas. And he said that it was brought to him secretly and anonymously in the night, right? There was some slight changes by this character, Charles Thomas, and it was approved June 20th, 1782. And this Great Seal is basically a token or a coin almost, where on one side you have the eagle with the 13 arrows and the 13 bows and the 13 stripes and everything's 13, the number of death and rebirth of this dying and risen God through all this time, right? And then on the other side, you have the step pyramid with 13 steps again, leading up to the eye of Osiris, Providence, Nimrod. It's been given various intonations over time,
Right.
Robby, you ever notice those things that hang off the Egyptian thing? It's like their little beard.
Yeah.
Does that have did you ever pay attention to how many lines go through that?
No, that'd be a good thing to look at, though.
Yeah, and I think there was things that I was showing in architecture. Oh, you saw it, Headless. I think you might have sent it to you. Or you came on anyway. Something when I was showing that architecture in Nashville. And how some of them I thought looked like if you looked at it, it could be a Jacob's ladder, and it had all these little
going up.
things. I gotta go look now and see how many
Yeah.
steps there are.
But then interesting, we were talking about 1776. We see the foundation of America, and we also see the foundation at the same time of the Bavarian Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt. So you have these ideas of rising against crown and altar coming about, which is what the United States was greatly about in separating from the British monarchy and the crown, and basically setting up a place that was not based on your religion or a monarchy or some overarching, basically creating the democratic republic that is the current grand experiment that we're living in now.
Huh. Yeah, I think a lot of what comes out of the idea of Virgil is that you have to sort of be above the fray, right? Because if you're within the fray as you're farming, you're getting bogged down, you're not doing the right things at the right time. What you should be doing is focusing on staying above it all. And that's sort of the difference between the farmer and the livestock, right, is that they stay above it all. So how much better would it be for farmers to have a set schedule and how things are going to play out, right? Well, if you look back at the history of how things are working now, you start to understand that there are a group of people that think they're above it all, that are trying to play along with this whole charade, and we get all these symbols. And instead of getting any actual information, we have to keep going back to the symbols. So once we go to the symbols, then we have to kind of determine what it means for ourselves, and we become more reactive. So this whole thing is sort of centered around the idea that maybe the human population can be managed using this sort of human zookeeper model.
Right.
But the difference between the human zoo animals and the human zookeepers is very hard to determine. You've got to be able to read things like Virgil and actually see through it for you to be able to sort of become that human zookeeper instead of the human zoo. So I think that's really what initiations and all the rest of this stuff kind of comes down to, is it's separating one group of humans from another in a authoritative capacity, right? And having the authoritative ability to know these things before they happen is what Virgil's talking about over and over again.
And I think you see this reflected greatly in the rise of the World Economic Forum and the stuff and the rise of the League of Nations, which failed, into the rise of the United Nations, into these global bodies that seek to establish some sort of a unification, even like the Pope now going over and trying to unify all these religions into a singular force. That
Pontiff Ex Maximus, the master bridge builder.
Yeah.
That's what it means.
Yeah. And so now when you get into this idea of the New World Order, right, you have George H.W. Bush, the senior, with his famous, New World Order speech that he gave on 9/11, before 9/11 happened, right? And then you have his son, the younger, in his address, in his inaugural address, he says, when our founding fathers declared a new order of the ages, they were acting on an ancient hope that is meant to be fulfilled. So, even we have these continuing political figures coming in, and, we see, Barack Obama, there's a new order, and, Joe Biden with his newspaper article in the Wall Street Journal, how I love the New World Order. We just see this echoing over and over again as history is progressing, and what they're doing to try to create this universal body that will control the whole,
Well, right now, I think people should be aware that they are retranscribing a bunch of scrolls from Herculaneum. And Herculaneum was one of the two cities completely destroyed by the eruption that took out Pompeii.
Right.
And what they found was that these scrolls were carbonized so that they could still find the ink traces. So now they're using AI and all the rest of this high technology to get these things. So just today, I saw a story that they had papers about Plato that were just recently transcribed, which says that Plato was a slave that was actually bought in 399 BC. And so that really changes the whole picture of things. Plato, means broad-shouldered. Maybe he was called broad-shouldered not because of the wrestling, but because he was a slave. He was working these fields.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting angle because he's like the top philosopher of all time who was basically sold into slavery. So can you really compare the ancient acts of slavery versus the modern conception of slavery?
Right.
I don't think they're even comparable at this point. I mean, if the top philosopher was a slave, what was going on there? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, and how much did that reflect on his mindset as far as talking out and against the state that he ended up having to take the poison for?
Well, was that Plato or was that? I think that was the guy before Plato.
Was it? Yeah. It's a lot of characters.
Plato's the second one, and then the last one is Aristotle. The first one.
Yeah, Plato. I'm pretty sure it was Plato that took the poison.
I thought it could be. Not sure, but that makes sense. They called him a
Socrates, the one in the chat said.
Socrates, there you go.
Yeah, they called Socrates the atheist. And it's like, how is he the atheist when he's acknowledging the gods and all the rest of this?
Right.
But that's the thing. It was a common practice back then to anybody that the state didn't like, they called atheists, right? So they called Jews atheists. They called, because they didn't,
kind of like they use Zionists now.
Yeah. It's
all
like
now we just have different words for it, right?
Right.
So
now, the saying "annuit coeptus" that's on the dollar bill is from the Ennead, book 9, right? Where it's basically a prayer of Aliscanus, the son of the hero Aeneas. And he says, "Jupiter Almighty, favor my bold undertakings." And this is just before he slays one of his enemies called Numanus. And so basically this being on the dollar bill, it's like the death blow against the empire as we separated and created this new grand experiment. The conceptual idea of independence, breaking away the sovereignty establishment, then you go back to Francis Bacon, who was the one who was behind the original colonization of America, who wrote the New Atlantis, and talking about the rise of an illuminated age. So there's been this consistent appeal within authorship of ancient writers to bring forth this utopian idea of this future novus ordo seclorum, this new world order that would be established in this enlightened age when Apollo came back to rule in a new age of Saturn, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that we see them as sort of chasing the prophecy.
Yeah.
But they might see themselves as ahead of the prophecy.
Yeah.
Right. So they're constantly saying, well, we need this and we need that. But that could already be a smokescreen. They could have already set in place these things. And this is sort of like the hint. If you want to be on the winning side, you've got to get with this, which I think is a brilliant piece of propaganda. If you want to be on the winning side, you have to be looking at these authors who, say things,
Yeah.
Well, who knows if they actually did it? I mean, it could be that they try to establish a world government when they run out of other ideas. They've got all the money. They're like, well, let's try and make a world government.
They have to build up the money in order to create the system to be able to instill the mechanism that they're seeking to establish.
Goes right back into human farming.
Yeah, exactly. And how many workers do we need in order to make this happen? How fast or slow it down when we get to the acceptable point? And looking at it from that standpoint. But then if you look at the Masonic tracing board, right? The sun is generally in a dark rift. and it's or the road to the underworld essentially, and the moon is in Pleiades, right? And this is linked with the Mayan calendar idea of the end of the Mayan calendar and the reset of time. So when we start talking about this great reset, you know, and this ending beginning time of this Mayan calendar, and you're talking about the apotheosis of George Washington in the Capitol Rotunda, right? Right in that same rotunda area is a frieze where the same artist painted this Mayan calendar with Cortez meeting the Mayans right there under the apotheosis of George Washington, basically being reborn as a god.
It's so appropriate because George Washington's family crest is 3 stars and 2 bars.
Right.
That's actually in Mayan writing as the number 13. The bars represent 5 and the stars represent 1. So if you look up Mayan numbers, you get 13. Well, that was actually his crest from way, way back.
Mm-hmm.
It's funny because it's also on the Purple Heart. So the Purple Heart ribbon that's given out has George Washington's family seal on it, which is a 13, which goes back to this Mayan Aztec numerals.
Death
and a
and
Purple
rebirth.
Heart represents sacrifice for the nation.
Right.
Blood sacrifice for the nation, kind of like what the Aztecs were doing.
Yes, yes. So now this painter that painted the apotheosis, his name was Brumidi. And he basically calendar, right? It has 13 steps or cocktoons that are 19.3 years each. And at the end of this cycle, if you start at 1776, over the 13 steps, the resurrection date is 2026.9. So, and this is when basically you're supposed to have the resurrection of this character, Bolon Yak Taku, who is basically the character from the underworld, very much like Apollo in the bottomless pit in the
Revelations.
You know, the Revelations. Yeah. And again, this is when time is supposed to reset. So there's all these philosophies that are kind of culminating about this idea of this resetting of the time, right? Which, like I said, ties in with the Great Reset.
So 2026 it is?
2026, if you start,
right.
Well, it's argued. You'd have to determine exactly how. I've seen different numbers of years for the cocktoons, but if you take it at 19.3 years, it's supposed to be 2026.9.
Pretty close.
Yeah, and that gets into, I have here the order of Quetzalcoatl, recognized by the Masons and the Mayan Freemason system.
Definitely.
And basically both of these lines tying back to Atoll or back to Atlantis, essentially.
Yo, another group that does have like offshoots of people that JJ Vance has covered it on my own on my show, that he's like an ex-Mormon. He was brought up Mormon. The Mormons even have a small little group of kind of like a sect that do travel to the Mexican pyramids to kind of worship Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ.
Right. And what was it, Crowley, when he was initiated into the 33rd degree, it was I've heard Mexico City by a Mayan priest who initiated him into the 33rd degree of the Freemasons.
I'm not surprised. In this 68th Convocation book, which is a meeting of Freemasons, Illuminati, the Rosicrucians,
yep,
in Pennsylvania, in a little place. I forgot the name of it, but they all got together there, and the only notes we have is the 68th Convocation. And it's funny because they had 67 other meetings before that of all of these groups coming together. And in the 68th Convocation, they say never take the vaccines, never ever take the vaccines. And this is in 1916 when this came out, and they're telling people not to take the vaccines back in 1916. And they're also saying that a pyramid of fire will be discovered. And they also have the completed rear it was both sides of the American seal. And the American seal wasn't officially recognized until FDR.
Right.
And so it wasn't really known what the official seal was going to look like. We had, sketches and stuff. And so when FDR finally approved it, it's the one from the 68th Convocation. So these guys are at the heart of business, right? And they're talking about this pyramid of fire. Now, what's funny is that in 2015, a diving expedition found a pyramid off the coast of Cuba, really close to that sort of peninsula right there. And it was like a mile off of Cuba. And there's a pyramid under the water being talked about in this 68th Convocation book, right? So how would they know about this pyramid that's under the water that, I don't know. But anyways, I haven't seen anybody talk about that. And that's one of the most interesting things to me is like, what is this group passing on? Is this an oral history that goes back to the time of Atlantis that they have? I mean, and then you think about people like Virgil, and then it all kind of, what if these people are just leaking certain stuff as a recruitment, factor?
Right. Well, and then getting into that whole idea of the turning wheel of the heavens and the five, petaled flower of the Rosicrucians is the same five petaled flower of the Lutherans, is the same 5 ages of the Mayan calendar. You see these 5 ages consistently that talk about the return of this dragon or the reset of time or the red dragon in the Bible. And then you get into this idea of the dragon's tail sweeping the earth and knocking a third of the stars from the heavens. And so are we coming to a point where this cyclical event in the heavens is actually coming back around, and it's all prophesized within the Capitol Dome, within Virgil's prophecy, within the Mayan calendar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasonic orders with the tracing boards, on and on and on. It's a lot of coincidences.
In the ancient world, like Gobekli Tepe and the Egyptians and everything else, you've got this obsession with keeping time. And then you come over to the Americas, you see that the Mayans have this absolute obsession with time. And then for some reason it fades away. We don't really see it anymore. Like societies aren't really obsessed with keeping time anymore.
Right.
And we see them going from the Gregorian calendar over to the Julian calendar, or vice versa, from the Julian calendar over to the Gregorian calendar. And we see them almost not care about time anymore. Like you'd think these elite families that trace their history back to the time when, they were basically just tribes trying to figure out what time it was.
Right.
Why were they obsessed with trying to figure out what time it is? Have you ever thought about what day it actually is?
Maybe
like, is it
maybe that was the
Thursday?
point. Maybe that was the point of the Gregorian calendar was, to confuse,
make people like us
time.
Completely confused about time.
Yeah.
So we don't know what day it is or whatever, and they know, but we don't know.
And I know in the past they've actually taken calendars and overlaid them to make days and wars that happen completely disappear from the historical landscape because those days no longer exist.
Right.
So when you start playing with, and this goes back to Sethos coming into Egypt, the pastoral, basically merging the sun calendar with the moon calendar and playing with these ideas of what time is as a whole,
Right. And I think that's the big thing, because Virgil, the very first thing in the book, look at the stars. Don't trust other people when it comes to this stuff. Look at the stars. The stars are your clock.
Right. And so when
literally.
the great sky clock, as Marty Leeds would say, but now when we get into this idea of apotheosis, right? When you go back to Apophis, essentially, who was Apep or Apepi he was in the Egyptian deity who embodied darkness and disorder.
Typhon.
Yeah, he was the opponent of light, much like Ahura Mazda versus Ahriman. Ahriman was the force of darkness. But we have in history a lot of figures that have been apotheosized or turned from a man into a god. And that's kind of what this whole technological revolution is. This transhumanism is the idea of turning the human into a god form, right?
That's what they say, but I think it's the opposite. They would actually reduce us down to the machine
and stick us inside a simulation.
Right.
So we're trapped even another layer encased inside the crystallization of matter.
Classic bait and switch, you know?
Yeah,
you know what's interesting? You guys were talking about stuff before with time, and like I feel like you're kind of touching on it with here. And I was wondering, I'm like, this might sound like really silly or basic, but like these people that weren't worried about time, like I was wondering, were they as fearful about death as we are? Because I honestly, I think really for most people, if you really do look at it, I think a lot of humans also look at time as our expiration date.
Right.
The reason for it existing is to be
that was the whole thing with Saturn. Yeah, he was.
It really has a lot of.
No, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And you're talking about it now because like a lot of things like, and then I'll shut up. I'll let you guys go. But like a lot of things like COVID or a lot of things that have happened or all these treatments. You have to do this to prolong your life. To prolong your life, you have to take this. It's like very much on scaring humans in dying soon, and this is what's going to keep you going.
Well,
what happens?
Just on that point, real quick, like even during COVID timing, what were they telling kids to get their shot? Was it to be a superhero, right? And all the
with climate change.
But putting that superhero mythos like in our head, and then maybe like you said, Headless, it's the bait and switch that to become a superhero, you actually have to like go inside of this simulation, and that's how they'll like market it to us to like prolong your life or
they're already doing it.
Extend your senses. You can become an X-Men too.
Well, and it increases the consumer class because while you're in that further simulation, you have to buy everything that you need. So they're just creating another marketplace for capitalism, or the Mammon system, the Babylon money system.
Oh my
Absolutely.
God.
But so now in the history, right, we have Voltaire, who is basically behind the idea of the crushing of the altar and the crown, right? That fomented the ideas of the revolution, the world revolution that was happening. And basically he
started both communism and libertarianism.
Yeah.
All in one fell swoop. That's so crazy,
It's an interesting correlation you make, Headless.
Yep. And he was a saint of the Jacobins. Who sought to overthrow crown and altar, right? And he actually initiated the high Jacobins and different kings and queens into a Mithraic mystery cult. Voltaire did himself, right?
He had his own mystery cult, which is so crazy because what happened to it? They're like, oh, no, it failed. Of course it failed. That's exactly what you would tell us.
Yes. But then I also came across the poster of the apotheosis of Napoleon. That I should have gotten it when I saw it. But then, that leads us right up to the apotheosis of George Washington. So when you look at the idea of this dead and risen God, right, going back to the ancient Egyptians and the phallus of Osiris and the belly of Isis, right, we have the obelisk in Washington, D.C., which is the phallus of Osiris. And then the Capitol Dome is the belly of Isis. And in that rotunda is this painting of George Washington being born again as a god in the higher realms, right?
Right. It's an egg, right?
Yeah, it's an egg, back to the idea egg.
The way that you achieve apotheosis is by hatching from the egg.
Yes.
Right. And that's the whole idea, is that's the rebirth process. It's like this light within the egg that goes all the way back to Phanes or Phanes as it's pronounced. So you've got this. What are those four angels called that they have all over the Catholic Church? You know this, Teresa. They've got the bull head, the eagle head, the man's head.
That's the symbols for the gospel writers. Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah.
Is that what you're thinking of?
Yeah,
like
it's
Matthew,
right by
Luke, and John?
It's right by the altar. That's one of the interpretations. But it's also like this four-headed angel.
Right.
I know what you're talking about, actually.
I
Right.
don't know.
That's
So
depicted in like older art.
yeah, there's also some speculation that it's the 4 classes of the angelic forces
Oh,
in
maybe.
Right.
the
But they're all
heavens
merged into one
into
thing.
one, right?
Actually,
And
might
they've got
have art
faces
for that.
on all sides of these podiums and stuff. It's obvious, like
Mm,
that's sort of like this beast thing. That's sort of
Yep.
like that Typhonian eternal light
I'm
right
gonna
there.
look it up.
And each one of those classes of angels were established at the 4 watchtowers at the formation
4 winds.
that basically protect the earthly realm from the forces of Khorasan overflowing and taking over.
Oh,
It's the
that.
cross symbolism. It's the 4
It's
winds
the
coming
4,
together,
the
and the man in the
solstices
center is
and
the
the
king.
equinoxes. Yes, man, basically crucified on time and space.
Right. And then
Yeah,
at the very heart of it is this soul symbolism of the sun. It's like the circumpunct. You know, it
right.
reaches out in the 4 different directions. And at the very core of it, that's the man that sort of becomes, you know, the man in the
3
egg.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
See, that even goes back to a lot, I think, into eyeball symbolism sometimes.
Mm.
Bingo.
Is because the pupil pulls out in 4 directions, but then screws closed like a
Yep.
snake around the egg.
Mm.
You know, and it does look like even the sun's sigil really looks a lot like the eye and the pupil.
Absolutely.
So with
Absolutely.
the symbol you were talking about, headless, it's called the tetramorph.
Tetramorph.
That's it.
It's
That's it.
yeah. So now I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's to represent the 4 gospel writers, and also the 4 the elements.
Yeah.
4 elements. Yeah. You've got alchemy right there in the Catholic
Yep,
Church.
yep.
And it's
Oh,
like,
for
oh,
sure.
no, we have nothing to do with that.
No, it have lots to do with that, of course.
So now Constantino Brumidi, the guy that painted this apotheosis of George Washington, right? If we look at the painting, he's actually surrounded by 6 elements, which make up the Hebrew Star of David.
Yep.
When you pin it down, right? So, and these 6 elements that he's surrounded by in the Capitol Rotunda in this painting, you have Neptune, which represents wisdom. You have Mercury, which represents commerce. Then you have Vulcan, who is the weapon. He created the weapons for the gods, relating back to Cain and the god of the forge or the blacksmith cult. And then you have Ceres, which is agriculture, or Ceres. And then you have Libertas, which is liberty, dating back to Semiramis and getting back into the ideas of liberty and justice.
Libertas is also syncretized with Diana
Yeah.
and Artemis. So Columbia, Artemis, Diana, Libertas, and there's another one.
Well, and all those go back to the Babylonian Akkadian being Semiramis, Ishtar, Nana, and the goddess cult of the spreading cult of Isis, essentially.
Right.
So all these are interrelated, layered on one another, coming out. You know.
Absolutely. And I think that's so present in Washington, D.C. And it actually has, I mean, like you said, it's all in the Bible as the opposite. Like,
yes,
all of these gods, the ones that are at the core of this, are all the opposite of the ones in the Bible. And it's funny because it's like this stuff survived past Christianity within the elites. It's not dead. I think it's because it works.
Right.
Like you know the tools, you start working on the thing. So if it works, you got to find out how.
So yeah, now this painting is 4,664 square feet. It's in the Capitol Rotunda, and basically George Washington is being essentially rebirthed as the new Apollo on Earth. And like we were talking about the ideas of time.
The Dolphin King.
Yeah.
And, well, that's what Apollo was called, as the Dolphin King. It's funny, Delphi, King. Dolphin.
Right. And hearkening back to the Saturnian age of, Kronos, all of those old titans were essentially encased in the cube in the center of the earth. and that's at the 0 point. You think about it, in the very center of the earth, it's timeless because, it's the center point of time. As you move from the center out, time gets longer and longer and longer. And as you go into space, potentially you can leave and come back hundreds of years later within your own lifetime. But that 0 point, that center point in space, it's almost like the idea of the Holy Grail, where when you become apotheosized, I think this is the idea of the one that walks as many, because
what was the Holy Grail? It was inside the cave.
Yeah. But
It's
you
always
switch
inside the
places.
cave.
When you become apotheosized, you enter that timeless realm of Saturn, that Saturnian age that's in the center of the earth, encased in the black cube. And then that spirit is allowed to enter into the physical world, per se.
That's interesting.
And this gets into the idea of when you start looking at the layouts of the street layouts of Washington, D.C. And it was George Washington that actually asked the High Freemason. Let me see if I can find his name here. But
French
he
guy.
asked, what's that?
It was a French guy.
Yeah, he was a French guy,
Louis...
right? It was Louis Deus.
Are you sure?
Nope. Let's see. Hold on, I'll find it here. But
he was a member of the Society of the Cincinnati too.
Cincinnati, yeah, that's what you were saying. But he basically built these. Here we go. Pierre Charles Lafont. And he was a French visionary, Freemason. He was asked by George Washington to design the streets. He was a French volunteer in the American Revolutionary War. And George Washington specifically said, design a new federal city on the Potomac for the young republic, right? But when you look at the street layouts of Washington, D.C., we've talked about the owl that's above the White House, is it? Headless? Yeah, so you have the owl, and then you have
it's below the Capitol. So it's in the trails below the Capitol. If you just go to Google Maps and then zoom out, you'll see the owl. It's a giant owl, yep.
Right. And then there's also a pentagram, an upside down pentagram coming off that in the street plans of Washington, D.C., right?
They've got a hexagram southeast of the Capitol. They've got a pentagram, which is actually part of a Kabbalah tree.
Right.
So that would be the very base of the Kabbalah tree,
right,
moving upwards.
Going up to the Freemason Lodge right there.
Right. Well, the Freemason Lodge is right in the middle of all of it. It makes a 90 degree to all of these things. Yeah. So it's like we are the 90-degree point of all of it.
Right. But that pentagram that's there, when you actually look at it, they didn't finish Rhode Island Avenue. So this is what you call a broken pentagram, right? And I just finished Faust 1 and 2 by Goethe. And basically Faust goes into the fact he summons up Mephistopheles, which is like this devil character, and he's conversing with him. And at one point, Mephistopheles steps outside of the pentagram inside the circle. And he's telling Faust, if you noticed, it's poorly drawn. Basically the pentagram and the circle is not finished. So it allows the entity to escape, essentially, right?
When you were talking about this before, it totally changed my mindset. I'm convinced now that there is a personification of the leak, or a god of the leak.
A leak.
Right?
Yeah.
So you've got the leaks that control Congress, the leaks that control our government, the leaks that are basically all of these things, all of the symbols we see, they're imperfect in a way that's like it's leaking something out.
Yeah.
And what's happening right now with the speed of light? It's slowing down. From the time that we've started noticing the speed of light using instruments, we've noticed that it's slowing down on average, which is crazy. So it's like this whole realm that we're in is governed by
degrading.
You know what's really interesting is I've watched something recently by Rupert Sheldrake, and he was like showing how I think one point, I think maybe it was around World War II, like the speed of light literally dropped. And he did say, he's like, there's one thing that's interesting about that is like, you can't say there's an actual constant. He says, because the speed of light goes a different speed through water than it does through air.
Yeah.
He
says,
is variable. It's a variable. But like, what is
Interesting.
it? Like he was
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
he
Well,
doesn't believe it's actually what we all think it is.
think it is, yeah. But now getting back to Goethe and Faust, right? One of the other interesting things is in Faust Part 2, Mephistopheles, they have like Bacchus come in. There's this grand parade with Pan and the nymphs, and basically this king, this symbolic king, right? And he's upset because his empire is not, it's not growing, it's kind of collapsing, right? So Mephistopheles says, we have this hidden wealth buried inside the earth, right? And he's like, so you can just issue fiat money to build your society up. So this takes the course over decades, right? And this king starts to issue fiat currency and creates such an inflationary mechanism that he creates a civil war within his own kingdom.
Nice.
So I kind of tie that in with what they're doing with the long-term plan of the World
perfect
Bank
banking model.
Yeah, and this was written in like the early 18 teens, so around 1803, 1816, around in there. So they know how these money systems work, and they know that when you sign on to a fiat currency, you're making basically a deal with the devil.
I think we have the oldest fiat currency in existence.
Right now. Usually they last about 200 years before they collapse.
Yeah.
So, they just actually, it was was it Barack Obama, where they renewed the Federal Reserve Act because they signed it for 100 years. Yeah. So they signed it for another 100 years. So,
they're not going to get another 100 years out of it.
Yeah, at the rate that they're inflating it and sending how many billions to all these countries for the war machine,
Well, we're on the third bank of the United States right now.
Oh yeah.
So the Federal Reserve is not that old, and it's the oldest in existence.
It's yeah. So now I was going to get into now around the painting of the apotheosis of George Washington in the rotunda, right? There are 72 stars in circles, basically pentagrams that wrap the circumference of that painting, right? And 72 getting back to the 1 degree of the turning of the five. The 5 ages, of
in the writing of the Bible, they had 72 priests from the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right.
And what they said is that they all repeated the Torah perfectly. And so that's how we know that it's legitimate and it's the real. But that was a Roman story that came back later on after they converted.
Josephus, who was a traitor to his own people. Yeah. But then also within rabbinical writings, when Enoch is transported into the heavens and doesn't have to die, he receives 72 wings when he becomes Metatron, right? And then he becomes essentially the angel in the whirlwind, which is the Shekinah that we heard George Bush talking about when we were going into Iraq, right? Right. And after the fall of the Tower of Babel, depending on the language, Ugritic's 88, but it was generally 72 of the children of Nimrod that took over rulership of the earth, right? Because God had basically stepped back and allowed Samael, the Lord of the air, to rule over this realm, right? And then the King James Bible, we have either 70 or 72 scholars that basically determined the number of books and edited it all together. But that 72...
They call that book the Big G. The Septuagint, that the Latins called it a Big G.
The Big G, yeah.
What does that go straight into? And then you've got the 72 tiles on the floor of the Masonic Hall and the chessboard.
Yep. And is that also how many tiles are on the chessboard?
72.
72.
I thought it was 72.
And I think it's 72, yeah. And that goes back to the idea of the exchequer. They used to use those chessboards to basically count money. And there was a secret, it was called the Knight's Tour, where if you knew this, you could like run the knight around the whole board in so many moves. And that was a secret communique that you were in with the school of the money,
64 squares. 8
Is
by
it
8.
64? Okay, yeah.
8x8 though.
8x8, yeah.
Mhm.
But now, when you go back to Barack Obama, right? He said he would complete his first 100 days in 72 days, right?
Mm.
And on the 72nd day, he went to meet with the Pope. And then on the 73rd day, he came back, and the Freemasons, which they never do, they held a big banquet for Barack Obama, very much in the same line as the Mithraic cults, with their banquet before the ascension of Mithras, you know. But then when we get into the construction of the Washington Monument, right, it began 72 years after the Declaration of Independence, right? So it was July 4th, 1848, being 72 years after July 4th, 1776. And the Washington Monument, there was 20,000 people at the laying of the cornerstone, which was 25,400 pound block that they put into place, right? And then there's you run across these myths of Benjamin Franklin created a magic square that was 6 by 6 that basically equaled 111 every way you added it, and equaled 666 in total, right? And they supposedly put this magic square inside of a hollowed out stone in the Washington Monument, with a Masonic Bible that was bound in a red thread, you know. So getting back into Kabbalah and you know,
I don't think people know how common magic was back then.
back then. Oh yeah.
I think that's completely outside of the modern American mind, is that these people were doing magic all the time.
They
you look
still
at Joseph Smith.
Yeah.
You know what? If you start taking like probably like, you know, the way the human race has, you know, developed or, you know, expanded. I mean, I guess you like, is it really any different than maybe it was back then? It's just like, it's just that through communication you can't maybe dazzle as many people.
Right. Right.
But like, I do wonder, has it always just been the problem of like a very few understanding it always? Just because of, and then you have to think of it this way, just through, I guess, like, you know, humans going on, the people are going to die off that actually understood it, and you're going to have more people that misunderstand it and then keep pushing the misunderstood idea of it
in the misunderstood
it's always just going to get, this is always going to be like that.
Well, I heard a woman from the World Economic Forum saying that the goal of all of the immigration is to bring global problems locally. Right. So no matter what's happening somewhere in the world, you're going to have a group of people inside the global village, as she called it, upset and causing problems until they can get a resolution that is good for those people.
Right.
So in other words, these global villages, which is all of the new cities with all the immigration and all these restrictive policies,
sneaking them in through there.
Right. Well, I mean, the whole idea there is that you take all the world's problems and you dump it on America, and all they care about are the problems back home, which is going to make, you know, all of these cities even more progressive, because they've got to have the progressive policy for every one of these, you know, difficulties that's causing congestion downtown. So the whole idea there is permanent states of upheaval.
Yeah.
And when you get in, when you get into Brzezinski, Brzezinski, and Henry Kissinger's works, they specifically talk about using immigrants as a soft weapon. You know, so that's a common thing, even going back into the past with the roving, you know, tribes of the barbarians and setting up the walls, and it's a never-ending process of the movements of people. You know.
Well, they were doing, I feel like at one point I had even brought it up. I mean, this is going back a few years now. It was probably like almost 2 years ago, when it was like, or maybe not, whatever, but like when it started getting really bad, like you remember when like you had different politicians, depending if they're a red state or a blue state, either like, oh, we'll take them here, or the other person was like sending them in a bus or a plane and punting them to another state.
Yep.
I was just like, yo, like you're using these people now just to like get people to like your name and think you're cool. that either you
Yeah.
took them or they think that you're cool and you're a troll because you sent them somewhere
Right.
else.
And Ron DeSantis, he's currently under investigation, and they're looking at bringing up charges against him for human trafficking, for basically sending people out of state.
They're
You
just
know?
going to push in that legal aspect. But I think the
Yeah.
really interesting
But that's
comparison.
probably like a slick shit move law that you could probably get.
You
Oh,
know
yeah.
how they do it? They just throw it into a loaded court, and then they, have the kangaroo court just rubber stamp anything they do.
Yeah.
It's becoming a
at the same
banana
time,
republic.
The movie Gangs of New York
Oh, yeah.
had a really interesting sort of take on the whole immigration thing, because that entire movie is about these, Irish immigrants, I guess, becoming Americans, right?
The police.
Right. The police.
Yeah.
That was the election that they had. They got all of these Irish people to vote as many times as they could so that they could get their guy in power, who was friends with Tammany Hall, the governor.
Yeah.
Right. Because they knew that the immigrants, if they had an in with the governor, would totally turn against their neighbors.
Yep.
Right. So during that time period was the draft for the Civil War. And so what they would do is they would grab these guys fresh off the boat and put them in army uniforms and send them down to go fight in the war.
Right.
And like the entire thing is what we're thinking about now. They said, well, what if we give away free citizenship to people who join the army?
They've been doing that since back in Clinton's time, man, that I know of. That's
Right.
something that's constantly coming into rotation.
But you can look at this Civil War era as another great reset. Like that's what they were doing in terms of population. They were taking all of these immigrants and putting them in the Union Army so they could crush the South. It's just
and as a whole, when you look at New York Harbor and the Statue of Liberty, which is essentially another French artist that created that statue for Egypt originally.
Right.
Egypt refused it. It was a re-gift and America took it. But you have the 7 rays of light, which are the rays of wisdom. All this stuff goes back into the ideas of Luciferianism, essentially. But at the base of the statue, it says, bring me your sick, your poor, your quivering masses or whatever. So basically the United States is founded on the idea of the melting pot, of the amalgamation of all the many thoughts.
Listen, guys,
know?
people just
but
don't
it was always managed.
People just don't like when it's not them who are the ones
Who's
like
in-
all of us came from immigrants at some point.
Right.
My family was prejudiced against when they came to Canada. Absolutely. People did not want them here. And now it sucks when it's your turn, doesn't it?
Yeah, but you know what the thing was is like I remember, because I've even said like that to even my father on the phone, and like he's like the thing is like I don't think people realize, he says, when my his parents came here, he said there was no services that was coming out of other people's pockets to pay your way.
Right.
You actually did have to kind of come here with a plan
and bust ass
or family already established here.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing too. So what was there to catch the immigrants when they landed on the shores of America?
Their own hard work.
Fraternal system. All of the immigrants joined fraternities. They were in the Odd Fellows. They were in the Freemasons. They were in all of these organizations which provided a certain level of insurance that they used to get cheap health care, right? What do we have giving away cheap health care today? Well, the government, but it's not cheap health care, and it kills you.
Yeah.
So this is the perfect environment to have as many immigrants come here as possible, because they just got to get their COVID shots.
Well, none of them were required to get COVID shots to come in.
Not
because
now.
there was liability issues.
But once they get that registration rolling, they're going to be like, we've got some requirements.
Yeah. Well, so let's get back to the Washington Monument, right? It's the largest freestanding, basically has no mortar. It's just blocks standing on top of blocks, right? But it's the largest freestanding obelisk in the world in Washington, D.C., right? It measures 555.5 feet high, which if you divide that by the foot by 12, right, you get 6,666 inches tall, right? And then it's 55.5 feet wide on each side, square, right? And if you divide that by 12 again, you get 666 inches wide. So, and then on the inside, I tried to get them to let me walk the steps on the inside going up, because I have read in a couple places that there's 666 steps going up, but they wouldn't let me. But when you take the elevator up or down, if you're going to the Washington Monument, ask them to turn the light on, because they usually don't do it. But inside, when the lights are illuminated, you'll see stones from Egypt. You'll see a stone from the Great Wall of China. You'll see stones from every major. And tell them about the Vatican stone, Headless.
Well, the Vatican wanted to send a stone, just like all the rest of these areas of the world wanted to. And so America took the stone and they took it down to the front of the Potomac and they smashed it into pieces. And they took all of those pieces and they dumped it in the river, just to send a message to the Vatican: you don't have any control here.
You don't have a place here in this. Yeah.
It's the stone the builders rejected.
Used.
Right? You're seeing two sides of these issues. It can be one or the other, but I think it's important to realize that it's that way all the time.
Right.
You always have these big gestures that can be taken any way you want to take it.
Right.
I think that's important, because we're seeing a lot of that today. Is these gestures by politicians and people in power. You can take it any way you want to take it.
Right.
And a lot of people
the inversion. That's the whole thing. Everything is inverted. So you're forced to come and look at the whole through the dialectic lens of both sides.
Right. What would you think if you were a Catholic in this country?
They
just smashed a stone from the Pope. That's horrible.
Yeah, right.
Dude,
what are they going to do to us?
I'm telling you, like online, just like from making more American friends, it's very hostile. Catholics in America. Like, I'm like, whoa, like this is like,
and the crown as well.
But I think this whole discussion like really begs the question about like freedom and liberty. Like, is that even a moral or a righteous concept actually? Is obedience more important or disobedience?
So, tracing the ideas of liberty and justice back, right? It was the idea of divine justice and the natural order and function of the turnings of reality, and it didn't necessarily have anything to do with right or wrong, but it was about this inherent sense of truth in all of time, right?
We still have in front of the courthouses, that's Themis or Dike Goddard. So all of those goddesses that you see holding up the scales with the blindfold on, that's a Titanides named Themis.
Yep. And then you have liberty, where when you get into liberty, like justice is very centered, whereas liberty is very expansive in regard to, you can do anything you want, the idea of freedom comes out of that. And then Benjamin Franklin interjecting the idea of happiness into the Constitution, which is so amorphous,
nebulous. It could be anything you want.
Right.
Well, I don't know. Like the original rebel, the original dissident was Lucifer.
Right.
So, like, is obedience or disobedience inherently evil quality?
Right. And that's always been the question. Right.
It's a big question. So, like, what are these ideals that America and the Western world in general is supposed to uphold?
Right.
Is it actually worth upholding? But then in the other extreme,
away from monarchy,
like Sharia law, like in the other extreme, you have like extreme obedience, and like that's not healthy either.
Right.
So,
I think the polytheistic sort of view of it was that you had to be in harmony with nature. And so it's the idea that maybe getting yourself further and further away from the land with all of these different ideologies that pushed us to the far corners of the globe, maybe that was what sort of turned us into seeing it the way that we see it today. Like, instead of thinking, well, how can we become more in harmony with the world around us? We're thinking, who do we have to go kill? We got to, we got to stop this. But it's like,
make ourselves independent from nature.
Right. I mean, that's what's going on right now with all the patriots thinking, well, maybe I can start growing my own food again. This is connecting their souls back with the land. That's important.
Yeah, that is important.
Mhm.
Well, and then when you get into the obelisk itself, being the shaft of Baal or the shaft of Osiris, the shaft of Nimrod, lots of different names for it. But at the very top of the Washington Monument is essentially a pyramid, right? And the capstone on the pyramid for the Washington Monument is the very first thing that the sun hits when it's coming up over Washington, D.C. And
It literally
these,
is a metal pyramid because they've got
yeah, it's
the
an
funnel,
aluminum pyramid.
right.
Right. And that now when you get into aluminum and the alchemical ideas of aluminum, it's not a natural substance that you find in nature. It's something that has to be refined out of nature, separated from nature, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
it's
always
called,
bound to other things.
right, it's called aluminum. Alum relating to the light, being that it refracts and shines light. So, within the ideas of illumination or Lucifer, the aluminum is very much a succinct symbol.
Ruby is actually an aluminum crystal.
Right, right.
Star
Yeah.
ruby. That goes back to the apotheosis because you got the star ruby, which is the six-sided star
Six-sided
ritual.
star, yeah. And within the aluminum silicate producing that six-pointed pattern, but it's also the most abundant mineral on the face of the earth.
Right.
Like I said, but it doesn't occur naturally, but it's in everything, right? Let's see. So where are we gonna go here?
Crowley had a ritual called the Star Ruby.
What's that?
Crowley did have a ritual called the Star Ruby.
Called the Star Ruby. True,
One of the
true.
few that actually did right. Yeah.
But what's really interesting is when we get into biblical prophecy and the idea of the beast in the bottomless pit being specifically related to Apollo, right? If we follow the character of Apollo back, he was one of the Hyperboreans during the Saturnian age that lived on that island of the true north. And essentially when the earth changed its rotation during the last of these great kind of resets or beginnings of a new time, Apollo came down from Hyperborea and he brought his medicinal gardens, which brought us pharmakia. He brought us the Apollo tree, which was the apple tree, which is symbolically used as the symbol of temptation.
Right, but it was actually a pomegranate.
I know, or some say what's the lemon? I've heard
Orange?
several. No, it's there's several different interpretations of what the fruit was to tempt, but it's just interesting now in modern vernacular that they say it was an apple tree,
Right.
Which very symbolically ties into Snow White, Apple computers, all these different ideas of temptation.
Right, but I think it's funny though that they were targeting Apollo even
Yeah.
in that propaganda, and it's like, well, let's see here. Maybe people kept I mean, they were doing a lot of magic.
Right.
They had a lot of connection to that pre-Christian era. I mean, that's where the folk magic came from. It didn't come out of Christianity.
No.
And for them to keep that tradition all the way up to the 1800s, that's really something.
Right.
And I think that's really, when they talk about Apollo being, this horrible beast, it's because he was very popular. Like all of Greece, all of the Mesopotamia, everywhere loved Apollo.
Yeah.
And so that's the one that they target. We got to go for that guy.
Right. He was both the preserver and the destroyer. He had these dual elements. But when you get into Apollo in the bottomless pit, and you get into Revelations 7:8, it says, "The beast that thou sawest was and is not, and shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. And they that dwell on the earth shall wonder, whose names were not written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast that was and is not and yet is." So that gets into this prophecy again of this one God that walks as many through time, constantly reemerging and coming back,
Right.
But Apollo, like you were saying, he was very favored.
Yeah.
in his early days. And it's just interesting how it
They
was
loved him in
twisted.
Italy too.
Oh,
Italy
yeah.
was huge on Apollo.
Yeah, yeah.
They still had Greek settlements in the south of Italy
Right.
up until today. Like they still identify themselves as Greek.
Well, and even when you go into Phrygia, there's one of the thrones there that had on the back of the throne, it says Apollo, Mithras, and Sol Invictus, all as one,
Right.
and when you get into the Mithraic cults, when it became Mithras in Rome, I think it was actually perverted and they began to worship Lucifer, turning Mithra, the sunlight, into Lucifer, which was when the bull slaying started coming back in, which was originally done by the Dark Force. So
Right.
it's
Well,
just
the bull slaying goes into Taurus and the procession
Yep.
of the equinoxes too.
equinoxes, right. But never did any of the Mithras cults sacrifice a bull, except for Ahriman, the Dark Force in the beginning, who made the creation of humankind from the bull's blood, right?
Ahura Mazda?
Not Ahura Mazda, the Dark Force, the Ahriman.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
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 so
he did use that.
Ahriman, he slayed the bull, and the blood became the creation on Earth,
Right.
basically all the life forms. And
The
then it
leech.
wasn't until the Romans when they picked up the bull sacrifice again. And the highest form of the Mithraic cults, when you got into that highest level, you found out you were worshiping Saturn or Kronos, essentially. So
Right.
Does
yeah.
that have to do with like the origins of bullfighting? Any of this? Do you guys
Oh,
know?
probably.
I would
I
wonder.
wouldn't
Right?
doubt it at all.
Yeah, and we were talking about that ceremony of the killing of the bulls. What was it?
Yeah, it was actually in Virgil's Gorgics. In the end of it,
Yep.
he talks about this Bugonia ritual,
There
and the
you go.
Bugonia ritual was practiced all over the Mediterranean. And what they would do is they would take a bull, they would put it inside of a shed, and then they would beat the bull to death with like 12 of your closest friends. You would beat
Yep.
the bull to death, and then as the bull is decomposing, bees, back to the beehive, bees would fly out of the bones.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah. And that was how you
What?
created the bees, essentially the flies that made honey. And that goes back to the ancient, there was another myth in Mesopotamia where they did the same thing with the lion, and basically the lion's head would generate the bees.
That's
And
in Samson too.
Yes, and what was it? The honey that came from the bees was considered to be the divine word of the Lord, and they would only use beeswax for the candles in the temples because it was illuminating. It was the wax that was provided by the heavenly forces. There's lots of this mystical stuff associated.
Well, think about the omphalos for a second. So that omphalos is the beehive, which is the center of the culture, right?
The
that
navel
connects them to the god of the sky,
right.
The navel going to the god of the sky. So the beehive is literally the home for that culture. And Minnesota is called the navel of the world. It's Minigota.
Yep.
And so they've got these world navels all over the place. It's like all of these gods have a place, that's important.
That's a good point. Yes. Maybe not.
So,
maybe there's multiple names.
Now the you were talking about the begonia ritual with the bulls, right? I was just rereading the Golden Bough, and he talks about at one point in one of the cultures they would actually put the guys in the shed with the bull, and instead of scourging them and beating them, they had to kill the bull by eating it to death.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
So it's but
like begonias, like flowers, like begonia ritual, because like even in the running of the bull, they throw flowers, don't they?
There was a scourging ritual which carries over into some of the mystery schools, and some of the degrees they would actually take these certain sacred branches from flowers and trees, and they would scourge the initiate. So this is kind of a thing that you see that morphs between the humans and the bulls and the different,
Well, It's funny.
Right.
It's funny the change, right? So it went from the bull being scourged to people being scourged.
Right.
Well,
Right.
if you look back at the rituals in Apuleius's golden ass,
Yep.
like the initiation is vaguely similar to what some secret societies do, but at the same time, it's completely off. Like they're doing the initiation in a way that is not like what they do today. It's almost like, you think you're an initiate, but they've changed it just so
Yep.
much that you're not actually receiving the benefits.
Right. Well, it's like the Blue Lodge or the base lodges, of initiation. And then from that, you have the higher degrees. And from each of those higher degrees, there's ones that you get tapped into that are systems within systems within systems,
Well, I think the initiations back then were meant to activate senses, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So you've got certain birthright senses that you're supposed to be engaging with, and they would have these initiations to try and get those senses to work, and then you see the seers, and like you were talking about the what are they called? The ones at Delphi, the ones that came up with the Sibylline books, the Sibylline priestesses.
prophecies. Yeah.
So the Sibylline priestesses, they always ordered Rome to go out and get new gods and bring them home.
Yep. And bring them home.
And one of those gods was this Attis worship.
Yep.
Which is where you would have these slaves
from Adonis. It came from Adonis into Attis.
Right.
Yeah.
And that happened in the same area of Phrygia.
Yes.
Right. So this is a Phrygian cult, and they bring it over to Rome.
Right.
And basically, these guys who are slaves have to castrate themselves.
Frenzied
after
castration.
going into this frenzy.
Right.
And then they would throw that castrated organ at a person's house, and whoever it is would have to take care of them for a year.
Yep.
As they got better from their self-imposed castration.
Then that castrated individual would become the high priest in the corresponding.
Actually, the high priest didn't have to castrate
the high priestess in the corresponding female temple.
Right.
Yes. So yeah,
and that's a Sibylline book import.
Right.
So these things are happening, and it's strange, and it's turning Rome into a very weird place because castration was actually illegal in Rome.
Right.
And so they've got these people who are doing illegal acts, but they're not citizens of Rome. All of the people doing the castration are on the low end of the totem pole. They're slaves who want to be free, and they're willing to castrate themselves to do so.
Right.
What's going on right now with the trans agenda?
Transgender movement. Yeah.
Right. You've got these people who want to become higher in station, who want a big government job to get the affirmative action. And so they're basically going through these castration rituals to come up into the echelons of bureaucracy.
Yeah. And also one of the things that I've kind of put together is that the transgender rainbow flag has nothing to do with the covenant of God with the rainbow after the flood. What the transgender flag actually is the alchemical flag. It's the alchemical rainbow, because as you do alchemy and you're transmuting things from one form into another, you get the appearance of all the colors moving through the rainbow as this, transubstantiation happens.
Well, I think even in that case, I think there's a process that the most common occurrence of like transgender in alchemy would be the double gender. So they would have both male and female.
Yes.
Right. The hermaphrodite, the divine hermaphrodite, which would be kind of the opposite.
Well, and that was the thing with the Mithraic cult, that blood that created the first humans was the divine androgyne that was created first. When you look into India and the various Vedas, and they talk about Indra being the divine androgyne that came down. So you have systemically through all these cultures, even Robert Flood in his Rosicrucian writings talks about the idea of the divine hermaphrodite, growing out, basically growing out like cartilage almost.
Right. I think what the the correlation here is that the people who are engaging in this would be modern day eunuchs. They're essentially removing any ability to reproduce, while the divine androgyne is like self-reproducing.
Right.
True,
True,
it was
true.
like Game of Thrones, the army, the Unsullied.
That's
right?
exactly it.
Which
That's
is
why they need them.
Eunuchs and slaves.
Right.
Right? Until
Right.
the mother of dragons, Reptilian,
Frees
she
the slaves. Yeah.
frees them, right?
Yeah.
Oh shit.
Interesting little fun fact about Game of Thrones as well is that
Virgil.
I was listening to something today, and they did use one of Virgil's battles. They actually used that in one of their episodes.
What was it? Yeah, one of the
it was inspired by one of Virgil's writings.
Yeah. So there's a couple more things I want to cover, and then I'm pretty much wrapping it up. But the 110th Congress of the United States, right, in 2007, they passed H.R. 33, right, which basically honors the Freemasons of America. And when they passed it, they said that most of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Freemasons. When you actually look at it, there was 56 delegates, and only 9 of them were Freemasons in accordance with the history. So it's just interesting they would pass H.R. 33, being the number of the master builder and the completion of the cycle, in 2007. And then I find it also interesting, getting into all this stuff, how Hillary's talking about, the tomb of Gilgamesh, and going back into the ideas of this dead and risen God, bringing that back around. It's just, so many weird and interesting things. Oh, and then have you seen the entrance to the IRS building in the United States?
Is that the one? It's like a pyramid from up above.
Yeah, it's no. They have a black pyramid that's engraved. It says "We the People," and it has an aluminum capstone on it.
Oh my!
So all these systems are, and Albert Pike, who was behind the 33, propagating the 33-degree Scottish Rite, system, 33-degree system. He basically has a statue right in front of the CIA. Used to. Did they take it down?
They took it down. Yeah, that was a big thing with the BLM. They took down Albert Pike.
That's the only one though that Trump wanted reinstated. That was the only statue that he requested to be put back up.
Albert Pike. Yeah,
he didn't care about the rest of them.
No,
you gotta save those Masons.
Right. Well, and he was the 33-degree, a Scottish Rite guy. Basically, if you read Morals and Dogma, he talks about, the seething powers of Lucifer being welded by the Masons to basically influence and build reality. So,
he also is attributed to the 3 World Wars document where he's
with
talking
Mazzini.
to the Queen.
Yeah.
Right? And he says that the last World War will eliminate religion.
Yeah.
What do we see? Holy warfare.
Yep.
Right on cue.
Well, and Mazzini, we covered this in one of the shows we did, but basically he says that the Hebrews and the Arabs will basically annihilate each other. And then with the Americans and the Christians, they'll be so aghast at what, they don't know what to do. So they'll be open to the ideas of bringing forth open Luciferianism, So, yeah. But yeah, it's just interesting, this whole idea of Virgil coming forth, the ideas of the inflection of the New World Order, the just all this philosophy kind of tying a nice little bow on itself,
Right. And it's so funny that the actual time period of Virgil seems to get frozen in time from then all the way up until Washington, D.C., when it's finally implemented.
When it's revivified. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And you see a lot of those elements still in London, right?
Yep.
But London was around at the time of, it was already a Roman settlement.
Right.
But But it's interesting that that was like the vision of Rome, and then it just sort of comes about, and
Right.
it's got all the same beliefs and everything else
Right.
that we don't know about. We have to sort of find this out on our own because
And
nobody's
sort it.
talking about it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and so, the idea of this Apollo, which we have in the bottomless pit in the Bible, basically returning to rule over a new Saturnian age, I feel also directly ties in with the rise of the Jewish Messiah, being the return of Jesus for the Christian, and
Yeah.
also sparking the Antichrist of the hidden Mahdi for Islam. So these prophecies kind of roll over into all the Judaic philosophies, like holistically, that seem to be culminating with this this red heifer.
That's why they call it the Big
More-
G.
More
The big
cows,
G. Yeah.
bulls and heifers.
And G is what, the 11th letter? It's the
Yep.
number of the magician, the foundation of the idea,
Jesus, 7.
Is it 7? Okay, so 7.
Yeah, counting
so,
it out.
so
I'm
that
like, wait.
ties in with the formation of the physical world.
Well, and
Yeah.
Lisa just said on the show you guys did about the red heifer the other day, the flight
Yeah.
that the heifers were on was flight 777.
Was it?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Interesting.
Virgil and simple equals 77.
77. Well, and all those 666s that we were talking about with the Washington Monument, I mean, that's the symbolic number of the sun, and gold and Christ and other factors as well,
Mhm.
So yeah.
Crazy.
Absolutely. Well, what do you say? You think that's a wrap, man? We went on for 2 hours.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I actually had assumed it would probably be about 2 hours. I
Yeah.
had both on. So that worked out perfect.
Mhm.
Thank you everybody too in the chat. An amazing chat, man. That was great. A lot of there was actually a lot of new people in there. I haven't noticed. That's also coming from Twitter and stuff. So I appreciate it. I'll let everybody kind of like plug themselves again real quick. Teresa, let them know what it is up with you.
Yeah, so you can find more of me on the Spiritual Gangsters podcast on YouTube, all the major podcast platforms, Instagram, and Twitter X, whatever we're calling it these days.
Yes, exactly.
Mhm.
And Headless, let everybody know what is up with you, your show. Plug your spaces.
You can find me on Twitter. Just look up the Headless Giant, and we do spaces every Friday night called "The Future Is Ancient." We've been talking about all sorts of stuff, but Etruscans always comes up, right? And there's a place in Italy in Etruscan land that has a sword in the stone, which I think a lot more people should look up. Just look it up, check it out. I think there's a lot more interesting mysteries out there than people even give it credit for. So look me up on Twitter. Don't look me up on Facebook. I'm not on there.
Thank you very much, sir. And Mr. Robby Marx, let everybody know what's up.
Yeah, if you want to check out my art, I have my website, my Etsy, where you can purchase some stuff. And then I also have the MetaMindcast podcast with all the other shows I've been on, as well as my Patreon and Facebook, Instagram, everything, on my link tree at RMARX, and that'll get you all my links.
Thank you all very much. I really appreciate you spending the time tonight. I know it got a little bit late. For people who are still listening, just to, I guess, give myself a shameless plug, tomorrow around 1:30, 1:45, we will be going live again, and we will be covering part 3 of the Smiley Face Killers, and it'll be me, JJ Vance, BD Salerno, and Lisa. So definitely keep an eye out for that. Should be really interesting tomorrow. I got some really interesting stuff, and I know they do. So definitely catch part 3 of 4 live if you got the time during the day. And again, I really want to say thank you for all the people in the chat. There was a lot of comments going on. A lot of people seem to be really into it, even had stuff to add. I really appreciate that. That's why I try to do lives. And if people are checking this out after the fact, when it drops, if you can, go check it out on a video platform. You will see a lot of the good comments also thrown up on the screen. So there is stuff to learn that you are not hearing from everybody. There's also, the listeners who got stuff to add. And that is the end of another Cult Rejects. And until the next one, everybody be well. Later.